Now, for all people out there who own a tube amp, I'd like to ask you a little bit about how would you recommend maintaining, what kind of things should a like none of a Marshall or a Fender or Boogie do like on a regular basis, you know, by their tech, by a qualified electronics technician to help keep the amp running longer?
Okay, first thing I would like to do is give anybody who has a tube amplifier a general warning. That is, inside of all of your tube amplifiers, they have what they call an electrolytic capacitor. They actually use several of these devices. These devices can store a high voltage charge, and even with the amp unplugged from the wall, you can open up your amp and there can be a potential for a dangerous electrical shock. So if you do not know how to work on an amplifier, or you do not know how to discharge the capacitors within your amplifier, do not attempt to service the inside of the amplifier yourself. Instead, bring it to a qualified technician. You know, you can always pay the technician, but you can't pay anybody to bring back your life if you electrocute yourself. Okay, there are several things that people should be aware of when dealing with a tube amplifier. Number one is always use a fuse of the correct value as stated by the manufacturer. If the fuse blows, it blows for a reason. There's a short circuit, there's a bad component in the amplifier, there's a bad tube, whatever. If you put in a larger tube and say, well, this will get me a larger fuse to get you through a gig, you may wind up damaging the amp beyond repair. So number one is always use the correct size fuse. Another common mistake people make with tube amplifiers is turn them on without hooking up a speaker or a suitable load. You can use an attenuator, you can use a speaker emulator or any other device such as that, but a tube amp does require a load on the output. If you do not have a suitable speaker plugged in to the output jack or a load, you can damage the output transformer and your output tubes. The output tubes can be easily replaced because they're plug-in items, but if you blow an output transformer, that is a major repair. Okay, there are certain things that you should do. For example, when changing output tubes in your amplifier, most amplifiers have adjustable bias configuration, which means there's a control inside the amplifier where they adjust the idle point of the tubes. Very similar to adjusting the idle in your automobile. You want the tubes to run at a certain beginning level and then they go from there. That should be done by an experienced technician. There are several methods of doing that. One is to use a signal generator and an oscilloscope. One is by measuring bias voltage. And the third method, which is my preferred method, is by measuring conducted current, since it's the most accurate method. Certain amplifiers are cathode bias. Cathode bias amps self-adjust. For instance, an Vox AC30 is a cathode bias amp. A Fender Champ is a cathode bias amp. Still, it would be advisable to have a technician look into these amps when you change a tube, because even with cathode bias, you can run across a tube that will draw too much current and be harmful to the amplifier.
That's interesting. I never would have thought of that in a cathode bias amp. And it's also interesting that you mentioned about the fuses, because I think I've heard some interesting stories where people have like wrapped tinfoil around a fuse that blew, and they ended up with some pretty impressive fireworks because of it.
Yes, if you don't have a fuse in there, you can certainly develop some impressive fireworks. Amplifiers step up the voltage internally. They run on higher voltages than come out of your typical wall outlet. In the United States, we have 120 cycle, 120 volt, 60 cycle current. In England, they usually have 220 or 240 in the foreign countries. But inside a guitar amplifier, some of the high-power guitar amplifiers actually increase the voltage internally up to 700 volts. It can be very dangerous.
Yeah, that's where you really need to have somebody work on the amp that knows what they're doing, because 700 volts will, you know, knock you down pretty well.
That's correct.
It'll probably knock you flying if you get enough of it.
Okay, there are a couple other little tips I can give people. One, if you are going to substitute tubes, which is a very good way if you have trouble in an amp. For instance, in a Fender amplifier,